Welcome to the Untold Story podcast. I'm Martha McCallum. It's great to have you with us this week. One of my favorite genres to read is big, fat biographies. And Susan Page has just written a fabulous one. It's called The Rulebreaker, The Life and Times of Barbara Walters. But for those of you who don't know, I want to give you a little bit of background on Susan before I bring her in. She's the award-winning Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today. Politics, the White House. She's covered 10 administrations, 10 past presidents, interviewed all of them, lots of interviews all over the world with huge, important guests. She moderated the vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, which Brett and I covered from that room. It was very well done. It was one of my favorite debates. So, Susan, it's great to have you with us.
It's so good to be with you, Martha.
Thank you for coming. You have also written probably the seminal biography of Nancy Pelosi, another fascinating political character, and Barbara Bush, also just an amazing life story, and a really strong and fascinating woman, Barbara Bush. So what made you decide that you wanted to take on Barbara Walters, and how long did you, I'm always curious how long it takes. How long did you take to write this book?
You know, it took not quite 3 years for me to do the book, and it was a pleasure. It was an exploration of someone we all think we know, but there was so much we didn't know about her. And that's the thing I've liked about all three books, is to try to tell the story of consequential women that we know less well than we think.
And you knew her when she was
I did not.
alive. You did not.
I never met her. It was my big reservation about doing this book. But there were a lot of, she had lived her life out loud, so she had done 1 million interviews herself. Yeah. And there were also still people around who had worked with her very closely at every stage of her career who I could interview.
Yeah, I met her a couple of times at events here in New York. And then one time many years ago, I went in to do like a one-day thing on The View. And she was intimidating. She was a strong, intimidating woman, but she was also she knew how to be warm and how to get people kind of to come in and like her, you know. And I think that's one of the things that you see in these amazing, real projects that she made about getting people to sit down with her. One of the things that you touch on a lot here is how she went about doing that and how she fought over, you know, with Walter Cronkite and Diane Sawyer. Give us some insight into how she landed some of these big interviews, including Castro and Putin and others.
Because as you know, the first step to delivering a great interview is convincing the newsmaker to talk to you. Yeah. And sometimes that took years and years. You know, Mark Chapman murdered John Lennon. She spent 10 years getting the first interview with him after that crime. She wrote to him right before the anniversary every year for 9 years. In the 10th year, he finally said yes. And that was her attitude toward all these people. She spent a lifetime trying to get Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis to let her interview her and never succeeded.
Yeah, Jackie Kennedy was like Queen Elizabeth. She didn't sit down and talk to anyone. You know, give us an insight into, you know, and what is she putting in these letters? This is what I always wonder. She's writing to Castro. She's writing to Mark David Chapman. You know, how is she convincing these people? And how does she do that without crossing the line of, you know, promising them that it's going to be an interview that will make them comfortable and not to worry about it?
Well, I think she sometimes crossed that line. Yeah. You know, I think there were several lines she sometimes crossed in her effort to get big interviews. And yet she would then deliver really tough interviews. You know, her interview, the last big interview she did, she was 82 years old, and she interviewed Bashar al-Assad in Syria as the Arab Spring was going on. What a tough venue to do, and yet she asked him every tough question. She showed him photographs of Syrians who had been tortured by his forces. She gave no quarter at all. I mean, I was really proud of her as a journalist for that one.
So what surprised you as you dug into this research over the course of 3 years?
So the source of her drive, which I think was her father, mercurial father, ups and downs, millionaire, then broke. And I think the other thing that surprised me was how lonely her life was. Mm-hmm. You know, we all try to balance work and family now. For Barbara Walters, there was no conflict. If there were two things she needed to do, one for her family, one for her work, work came first. She was relentless that way. She thought she had no choice. And maybe at that time, being the first one doing all these things, the first woman, maybe she didn't have a choice.
You write about how she felt at a young age that she sort of had to take care of her family financially.
Yeah. When she was 28 years old, her father attempted suicide. And at that point, she thought, my father, who was obviously suicidal at that point, her unhappy mother, her special needs sister, she was going to be in charge of them financially and in every other way from then on.
You know, when you look at the people that you have written about, do you see any commonalities? You know, when you speak to these different women and study their lives, Nancy Pelosi, Barbara Bush, Barbara Walters, are there commonalities that you see between these three women?
You know, I found commonalities. I didn't start out recognizing them, but you know, all three members of the silent generation, all three at the point they were born, they had zero expectation that they would be people of consequence. And you know, all three of them reasonably late in life became the figure that became iconic. You know, for instance, Barbara Walters was 30 before she really got started in television. Nancy Pelosi was 47 years old before she ran for office for the first time. So it gives you a sense of the second chapter that many women have in their lives.
I like that. I like second and third chapters in life. You know, she had a relationship with Roy Cohn that I think is pretty fascinating. He's one of the toughest, you know, New York attorneys there is, or there was. And he was also really a person who was very much admired by Donald Trump. So talk to us a little bit about the Roy Cohn, Donald Trump, Barbara Walters connection.
Yeah, definitely there. Barbara Walters was 25 years old when she met Roy Cohn. He proposed to her repeatedly, even though he was, as we know now, a closeted gay man. At one point, she seriously considered marrying him, and they never married, but her relationship with Roy Cohn, it lasted longer than any of her three marriages, and she relied on him for advice at key moments in her life, and he was a fixer for her. He took care of some legal problems that her father had. When she wanted to adopt a child, he facilitated a private adoption of a newborn. And you know, I think that Roy Cohn had that kind of relationship with any number of people, including Donald Trump, someone they could turn to when they needed a favor done.
I know. I always think, especially covering this trial now that Donald Trump is in, and we're waiting for this week. We're waiting for Michael Cohen to be on the stand. And I often think, you know, when he first dealt with Michael Cohen, who's also super aggressive in that Roy Cohn sort of way, did he think like that he was getting like a young version of that because he likes his attorneys to be really ruthless?
Yeah, and Roy Cohn was totally ruthless. But, you know, that didn't put Barbara Walters off. I think it's the legacy of her father, who was a man who had a dark side that she was always drawn to. She found it appealing to talk to and deal with and interview men who had both maybe great fame, but also something dark inside.
You talk about the secrets that she would take to her deathbed. What can you share with those without ruining the book?
Well, you know, she had a sorry end. She had cognitive problems. She became very frail. She was in a wheelchair, and at that point, she pushed away even her closest of friends. So she was living for the last several years of her life in her fabulous Fifth Avenue apartment, but surrounded by caregivers.
With regard to her personal life, and you say that she always put work before family, was there anyone that she loved, anyone that she would put first over her work, do you think?
Almost. And that was Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts. She later called him the great love of her life. They had an affair for about 2 years, but he was a senator and married and a black man. And Roy Cohn warned her that if this came to light, and this was at a point they were talking about, would he leave his wife and marry Barbara Walters? Roy Cohn warned her that if she did that, it could cost her her career. And so even with the man she called the love of her life, she broke it off.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
You know, it's interesting to mark her career, which really spans probably all of the best years of television news. right? And we see the industry change all the time. And now there's a different kind of celebrity journalism. When I was growing up, I remember her sit-downs with, Whitney Houston and all of these stars. And literally as a family, we would gather around to watch the Barbara Walters special, and she would go through, Anwar Sadat and, people like Whitney Houston or Willie Nelson in this great combination. I don't know that anyone could ever do that again. Why do you think that is?
And people hadn't really done that before. Serious journalists who would interview Anwar Sadat would not interview Whitney Houston.
Right.
But it was one of Barbara Walters' innovations to blur that line between entertainment and news, because she found everybody kind of interesting. Anybody she found interesting, she thought they had a story worthy of telling. So she would talk to prime ministers and despots and Hollywood stars and singers and notorious murderers, and they were all interesting to her. And it sounds like with your family, at least, it was interesting to the people who were watching too.
And, I was thinking, who would you really want to see one of those with now, right? Like tell a real sit down with Taylor Swift. I don't know if she ever did that, but I guess Taylor Swift wasn't really that famous at that point. But, but Taylor Swift probably wouldn't do a Barbara Walters interview because she has all these other ways to get her message out, right?
It's just a different world. In Barbara Walters' day, the networks called the shots, the broadcast networks. That was the way newsmakers or those facing trial or those running for office could reach the American people. That's not true anymore. There are 1,000 ways now for people to reach out and connect with the audience they want to connect with, and that has been a huge challenge for journalists of all sorts.
It's interesting because it used to be that you sort of had to eventually sit down with someone, right? If you were a newsmaker, so you'd have these battles that you document so well in the book. Andrea Mitchell thinks she has the interview and she travels to Cuba, and then at the last second, Barbara Walters has slept in and scooped her. I mean, we all know that feeling of thinking that you have something nailed down, and then, oh my gosh, someone is in front of you. So, in that way, I just wonder if we are ever going to see that kind of journalism again.
I think we're going to see outstanding journalism that tells us about big personalities and people in the news and the people shaping our world, but it won't be the same as that. It'll be some different configuration. And I was wondering the other day, if Barbara Walters was still around, how would she be handling this new media world? And I don't know, but I bet that she would have a podcast.
She probably would. She probably would have a great podcast. But I guess what I was getting at in that question, Susan, is that there's not a lot of, in terms of ways to hold people's feet to the fire, it seems like a lot of times, and people can find ways around it through social media, through just presenting themselves the way that they want to present themselves and not sort of putting themselves in that kind of situation that I think prior people felt they had to go through that gauntlet. But now, and even I think of debates. Are we going to have a presidential debate? Do people now feel, in this case, Biden and Trump, that they'd rather not and they can get away with not doing it?
I think we will have at least one presidential debate.
So.
I don't know that, but I think we will. But you're absolutely right. Look at our presidential candidates now. Joe Biden does very few news conferences, very few mainstream news interviews. Donald Trump does interviews mostly on what he considers friendly outlets. So we don't have this commanding figure like a Walter Cronkite or a Diane Sawyer or a Barbara Walters saying, you have to come talk to me to be legitimate in whatever your ambitions are.
Yeah. And you also talk about how she would just book her own thing. She didn't talk to anybody at the network, and we've all, again, had those situations where you kind of do something on your own and then, oh, wait, we're coordinating it this way. We didn't know you had that plan. She didn't care about that.
Yeah, I mean, she often didn't pretend she didn't know you had some other plan. I mean, famously with an interview with President Clinton in 1996, that ABC had decided we're going after an interview, and it is Diane Sawyer's interview, and Barbara Walters went around to the White House staff, made her case about why it should be her, not Diane, and they gave it to her, which caused just a huge firestorm within ABC.
I'm curious about you and your work and these books. I wrote a book about World War II. And how do you construct your day? Where did you find time? How did you build in the time? It's a lot. to write a book that you're serious about, that you care about, that you're deeply researching. How did you do it?
So tell me, how did you do it?
So I did it a lot early in the morning, like 5 a.m. in the morning, to get up and work for a while, and then a lot of times late nights at my desk with, tons of files and pieces of paper that I was pulling together to put together this story. But it was, I would say honestly, I've only written one book. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done.
I agree on the early morning side. Ever since I had little children, I've gotten up really early because it's the only time no one was yelling at me.
Yeah.
So I definitely get up 4 or 5 a.m. I'm no longer coherent by the end of the night, so I don't do that. But when I begin a book, I make this timeline that says you have to do this by this month. You have to do this by this month. And if I get to the end of the month and I haven't reached the goal I set, then all I do is focus on delivering on whatever it is I've calculated I really need to do. And that has kept me pretty much on track.
So when you look like the deadline's looming and you're not there, you cancel dinner plans, cancel social things, and just say, I got to work.
Family, who's family?
Exactly. Do you have a preference now in your life? So when people say, what do you love the most about the work that you do? If you had to, do you prefer writing to the work that you do at USA Today or covering politics?
It's like saying, do you love your son Will more or your son Ben more? Because they're both such a privilege. I just feel so privileged to be able to do either one of them, much less both of them. And they're different. They're like using different sets of muscles. I'm sure you found this with your book. It's different than daily journalism, and I love daily journalism, but this has been such an interesting path too.
Yeah, there's something about, I'm sure you feel like when you're writing this book that you're just walking around with her every day for 3 years and learning
such a
new
bore.
things every day, right?
It's like every time someone mentions something, I'll think of, Barbara Walters faced a situation like that. My poor family, putting up first with stories about Barbara Bush, and then everything reminded me of Nancy Pelosi, and now we're in the Barbara Walters chapter.
So that's my last question. Who's next?
Well, who would you like to read a biography of? I like women. I think I would like to do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I read Audition. So did you feel that you gave her sort of a harder edge than she gave herself in Audition?
More three-dimensional.
Yeah.
And there were things that she disclosed in her memoir Audition that we didn't know before, but there were things she misrepresented, and there were things she left out.
Yeah. Okay, so women, I would like, I think, you couldn't really do it at this point because she's too young, but, the Princess Catherine would be a fascinating person to dig into. She's got, she's going through things right now, but
Taylor Swift, you mentioned
Taylor
her.
Swift. Yeah. Personally, I'm not a big fan. All the young women around here are all huge fans, but yeah, she would be interesting probably to profile because she's such a force.
Yeah, and in so different ways, singing and business. Clearly an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
People with a lot of angles. I think they make good subjects.
Yeah. Who else? Anybody else on your radar?
I don't know. I've got to get through this one first.
All right. Well, Susan Page, thank you so much. The book is called Rulebreaker, The Life and Times of Barbara Walters. And she really was just a fascinating person. And she blazed a trail for so many of us. She was tough as nails and just what a life. What a life. Yeah. Susan, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.